Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and selamat sejahtera everyone. So I am Yudariah Muhammad Yusof. Here I would like to share with you on effective assessment of student learning in outcome-based education. So I hope at the end of this presentation, you should be able to explain the concept of alignment between assessment and learning outcomes, as well as plan and design effective assessment that gauge students' learning. So what is assessment? Okay, so basically assessment is a systematic process of collecting data, gathering and collecting data, so it can be marks, scores, okay, that enable you to analyze the achievement of the outcomes as well as the effectiveness of the learning activities. So in a much more broader definition, assessment include observing, measuring, recording, analyzing of students' performance against certain standard or expectation. So, but the important question is, how can we design effective assessment that gauge students' learning? So these are some important questions that we can use as a guide. Okay, so why do you assess? What do you want to assess? And so on and so forth. Okay, the diagram that I showed you here is illustrating the taxonomy of approaches to assessment. So if you look at the diagram, okay, what we measure, that is the object of assessment, or what to assess, okay, that comprise of the cognitive, psychomotor and affective domain, is determined by the level of assessment, that is who to assess. Okay, either we want to assess it at the course level, at the program level, or at the institutional level. And it is also determined by the purpose of the assessment. Why we want to assess? Are we going to assess it in a formative manner or summative? Okay. So the one that we showed you here is an example for assessment at the course level. Basically, what we want to assess here is the achievement of the course learning outcomes. So for individual improvement, okay, that is actually the purpose of assessment, is for individual improvement. So the results of the assessment will help us to improve students' learning, to give feedback to them, and so on. So an example is the individual performance test. And for gatekeeping, okay, so this is to accredit qualified students. So the purpose here is basically for grading or accreditation, okay, where the assessment that we give allows students to demonstrate certain skills or knowledge they had acquired. For example, giving written examination. Now for course improvement, okay, for example, to improve the course or to monitor the progress of students' learning. So the results of the assessment, okay, the individual assessment results are aggregated to serve the course evaluation. Now, course evaluation is to provide statistics for the course. That means the assessment that we gave, okay, allow us to get information regarding how students are doing. Okay, so an example of course evaluation is the course review report. Okay, so all this assessment, okay, when and how to assess, okay, refers to the timing. When do you want to give the assessment? Either you want to give it in between the semester or at the end of the semester. And how to assess are the assessment strategies that you use. Either you're going to give examination or projects or presentation, okay, and so on. So those are all the assessment methods that we use to gather information. So the purpose of assessment can be categorized into three. That is assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. So the purpose for assessment for learning is to measure our own performance as teacher. That means the results of assessment that we obtain here is to inform about the effectiveness of our own teaching, and it can also use to provide feedback to students about their learning and how to improve. Now, assessment as learning is given to track students' learning, okay, to identify the strengths and weaknesses, while assessment of learning is given to measure students' progress. Now, assessment for learning and assessment as learning, this kind of assessment occurs while students are engaged in the process of learning, compared to assessment of learning occurs at the end of a learning process or task. For example, when you give a final examination, so normally it's given at the end of the semester. Now, this is the assessment cycle. So it gives us a framework for developing an assessment plan at the course level. So it constitutes of 4 stages. So it starts with formulation of the intended learning outcomes. That is what we want students to learn, okay, followed by developing or selecting assessment methods that allow us to measure or to gather information on the students' achievement. Then we need to create, okay, the experiences, that is the teaching learning activities to prepare students, okay, for the achievement of the outcomes. And the results of assessment that we had gathered, okay, can be used to improve teaching and learning. So these are some guiding questions that can help us, okay, during the assessment process. So as you can see, the assessment process is a mechanism for change. So it is outcome driven, where the process focuses on the measurement of change, in this case the outcome, that has taken place based on the teaching and learning activities that we had implemented, with the aim of achieving the intended learning outcomes. So the results of the assessment that we had obtained can be used to support future change and improvement. For example, as you can see from the diagram, okay, so we can use the results to award a certificate or for grading, to give grades to the students' achievement, or it can also be used to for quality assurance, that means to for accreditation purposes, okay. Or it can also be used to inform or to improve on teaching and learning, and for sustainability. Okay, so sustainability here refers to where the results can be used to support decision making and policy in a broad environmental, economical, and social context. So I'm sure you have seen this diagram before in previous session. So this diagram illustrates the relationship between design, delivery, and assessment. So in OBE, in outcome-based education, curriculum is designed so that the learning activities and assessment tasks are aligned with the learning outcomes. So as you can see from the figure, there are 3 stages. Okay, so the planning stage, answering question to what do we want our students to be able to do as a result of our teaching. Okay, then the implementation stage, give answer to question regarding what teaching learning activities can we adopt to achieve the intended learning outcomes. And finally, the assessment stage will provide answer to can our students do what we want them to be able to do. Now, linkages between the outcomes, the design of the assessment task, criteria, the marking procedures, and feedback are actually the key principles for effective assessment. But Brown, in his work, found that this is also the common weaknesses of assessment systems, where he found that there is no linkages between outcomes and the assessment task, the criteria, the marking as well as the feedback. And what he had found in 2001, so what Brown had found earlier in 2001 was further supported in the work of Cohen, who found mismatches between learning outcomes and assessment. For example, in this particular outcome that says students will be able to solve demanding problems, what Cohen found is that almost 50% of the questions in the final exam paper were just asking answers word for word and symbol for symbol as in the lecture PowerPoint notes. Okay, as in another example of the learning outcomes, we say students will formulate critical judgment and analysis. The assessment given were just direct regurgitation of analysis and judgment which had been emphasized in the lectures and references provided. So the constructive alignment, there is the coherence between the outcomes, the teaching and the assessment is actually the underlying principle or the main theoretical underpinning outcome-based education curriculum. In fact, the constructive alignment is also the key to creating effective assessment. So how can we design a constructively aligned teaching and assessment? So Biggs and Tang suggested 4 steps in designing such teaching and assessment. So first, we need to state the intended outcomes in the form of standards. Okay, so that's why in the previous workshop we had emphasized, or you had learned how to write the course learning outcomes using the guideline provided, and then you need to create the learning environment, that is the teaching learning activities to bring about the intended outcomes. That means to activate the verbs that you had used in the learning outcomes statement. This is followed by choosing or developing assessment tasks that will allow you to judge how well students' performances meet the outcomes. And last but not least, you need to develop some kind of criteria for you to evaluate the quality of student performance. So the assessment tasks or methods that we use to collect information of a student's achievement can be categorized into 4, okay, as proposed by Stiggins. Okay, so the first is the selected response. So this refers to methods of assessments that require students to select correct or best response from the list provided. For example, in the multiple choice questions, true, false, or matching. Now, the other category of assessment task is the constructed response. So this kind of task requires students to construct written answer in response to a question or task given. For example, an essay, short answer questions, a concept map, and so on. So the next category is the performance assessment. Now this is based on, so this kind of assessment or task given is based on the judgment or observation of performance or product. For example, presentation, the experiment in laboratory, the project, debate, etc. And the last category is the informal assessment, or sometimes known as the personal communication, where information is gathered through interaction with students. For example, interview, you have the observation, the thinking aloud, self-assessment, peer review, and so on. So if assessment is used to improve student performance, so Wiggins suggested that we must ensure students know the expectation, okay, the criteria or standards that we use to judge them, and also the teaching and learning activities or the opportunities provided, okay, to enable them to learn from the assessment to improve future assessment. So in implementing constructive alignment, choosing the assessment tasks or methods will engage students in the kind of learning activities that we desire, as shown in the figure. So how can we develop the appropriate assessment tasks? Okay, so the basis of our development is the learning outcomes. So we have to make sure that the learning outcomes that we have set are clear. Okay, and based on the learning outcomes, we can then design the teaching learning activities to prepare the students to achieve the learning outcomes. Okay, and finally, the assessment tasks that we had choose or that we had designed, it will allow students to demonstrate their achievement of the outcomes. So this is how we can link the assessment and instruction. So what is worth learning is what we assess. Now how it should be learned is how we assess, and how well we expect students to perform corresponds to how we communicate the results. So these are the possible assessment task methods, okay, that are aligned with the learning outcomes. So for example, if the verb that we use in the learning outcome, okay, suggests that students should be able to describe, for example. So the appropriate assessment tasks or methods that we should give are assignment or essay, question, exam. Okay, or if you want them to able to analyze, okay, as in 5, so the possible assessment tasks should be case study or assignment. And if you want them to communicate, able to communicate, then a range of oral, writing or listening tasks, example presentation, debate, role play, and so on, are the most appropriate assessment tasks or methods for you to use. So to summarize, okay, assessment in practice, okay, how you assess students can be either formative or summative, and from there you can choose or develop a variety of assessment methods, for example, exam, essay, portfolio, presentation, etc. And you need to create or develop some kind of judging criteria, what we call the assessment criteria, to enable you to judge the quality of the students' achievement. Okay, so this criteria will be used for marking process as well as the feedback strategies. So this is a reflection, what we call the 3-to-1 reflection for you to do. So if you can give 3 important ideas that you have learned about assessment, 2 concerns that you still have about assessment, and 1 step that you will take related to assessment. Now for your information, this is an example of a formative assessment. Okay, so this is the assessment for learning. So the information that I can get, okay, from your responses will inform me about the effectiveness of my presentation, as well as I can use it to give feedback on your performance. Okay, so please try this reflection. Okay, 3 to 1, self-reflection. So that's the end of the presentation. So thank you.